Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if I'm not super energetic because it's super late here and I started teaching 8 in the morning. It's 11 at night, so it's getting late. Okay, so fast. This is going to be about, oh, if I get this to move, hold on. Okay. So basically, if you think about public provision of education, we started off by having schools spread around different neighborhoods, thinking that you would be locally providing education and thinking of education as a homogeneous good that you were providing everywhere. And so basically you were assigned to school, there was no school assignment, you were just going to the neighborhood school because all schools were basically equal. But then over time, especially like in Europe, it's more clear, no? In the US, because the financing of education is depending on property taxes, you would think this is less true. But in Europe, finance was super constant. So really the presumption that schools were more or less the same was pretty decent, let's say. But over time, just given the fact that provision of education is local and that there's heterogeneity in neighborhoods, and that sort of feeds into what happens in schools, the kind of teachers that want to go, and so on and so forth, we actually over time find that there's been more and more heterogeneity. And not only in terms of what the schools offer, but also pedagogical strategies. There's innovation on what schools do. There may be, language and religion or specificities about whether you do more sciences and so on that would call for choice. Okay, so this is like the most used policy worldwide, I think, in terms of education in the last decades. But then at the same time, there's also been this identification of a problem, which is that there's actually a lot of failing schools. So it's not about there being heterogeneity and people wanting different things, but I think a little bit what Eric was mentioning before, that actually what we really care about is some schools being just good, whether it's more in math or sciences or music. At the end of the day, what you want is schools to be good and not to be failing overall, which is what in the end has been turned out, has been shown is a big problem, no? That there's some schools that are basically not desirable for anybody. Nobody wants to go to those schools. And I think that one of the things that school choice has artificially thought of, in many places, school choice has been implemented as a way of sort of simulating that one can get away of these schools. No, so there's a No Child Left Behind Act that was saying, everybody should be given a chance to leave their schools, and said that that's why you have more choice and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if somebody has to go to those schools because there's not enough seats in the other ones, that is actually the real problem, okay? So, and this is going to be a little bit that the emphasis in this talk is going to be that the fact that there's these schools actually is going to lead to a lot of blocking and a lot of problems for the most used mechanisms, okay? So a way of capturing what we're going to want to say is to say, well, in principle, school choice in many occasions has been viewed as really as a getaway channel for people who were systematically assigned to their failing schools because those were the neighborhood schools. So it's really something that is aimed at facilitating that families go beyond what is the neighborhood school. Okay, so we're going to just talk about this access to better schools, which is capacity of a choice mechanism to allow for people to go to something better than their neighborhood school. Okay. Okay, so then you have all these different mechanisms that everybody's very familiar with. I'm going to briefly describe them in a second, but one of the important things that happens is that whatever mechanism you use, the problem is that there's overdemands. If you didn't have overdemands for certain schools, you actually would not need to implement any particular mechanisms, right? Because you would just let people go wherever they want to. But the fact that there's limited capacity means that you have to decide how you're going to rank people and what you're going to do with people that are not accepted into their first choice, what kind of alternative options you're going to give to them. Okay, and in many cities, the way you resolve overdemands is by ranking people according to whether they live in the neighborhood or not, okay? So we're thinking of cities that had neighborhood assignment and then they moved towards choice assignment. You allow for choice, but then there's still, if there's overdemand for a certain neighborhood, you still break ties by giving priority to people in the neighborhood, okay? So if we define access to better schools as the expected fraction of individuals who are allocated to a school that is better than their neighborhood school, what we're gonna basically do is compare the three most used mechanisms, which are deferred acceptance, Gill-Shapley deferred acceptance, immediate acceptance, or so-called Boston mechanism, and the top rating cycles, okay? And the main result and takeaway, and you're gonna see that the presentation is super like non-concrete, concrete in the sense that I don't get into the details, but the big headlight is that if you have these failing schools, which are schools that everybody agrees are worse. So if you had just the rank order list, you would just have like, there's a commonality at the bottom. Okay, so the top can be whatever you want, but there's a commonality at the bottom. So if everybody sort of agrees that some schools are just not desirable, they don't have to be super undesirable. They just have to be worse than the rest. Basically, both deferred acceptance and immediate acceptance will lead to limited access to better schools. And it's not, so basically what's going to happen is people are not going to be able to get away from their neighborhood school. Okay, so in some sense, this is saying, unless we get rid of failing schools, there's not going to be real choice. Okay, so if you have this different, if you break ties using this neighborhood assignment, and you could also like understand the results would be the same if you have different priorities for different people in different schools. Okay, so the mathematical property that you need is that people basically have highest priority for different schools. And if that's the case, basically what's going to happen is that the fact that there's some schools that people dislike will put people into their highest priority school independently of what their preferences are. Okay, so let me just convey the main intuition behind the result with a very simple example. Okay, so we're just gonna have, and here I wished I was in front of you guys so that I could point out at people and not have to refer to the table, because I think it's a fairly intuitive and simple result. So basically what's going on is there's this the example was with schools, it's easily extendable to many more schools, but basically what you need is that you have a school that people dislike. So it's school 3, and this school is the bottom for everybody. Okay, and then people disagree on what the top are. Okay, so suppose there's these 2 good schools, and there's a person who lives in that neighborhood, and a person that lives in that other good neighborhood, but they just happen to like each other's schools better. Okay, so the person who lives in neighborhood 1 that would have priority for school 1 actually prefers to go to school 2. And similarly, the person that lives in neighborhood 2 prefers the school in the neighborhood 1. Okay, then there's people living in neighborhood 3. Here we're just saying they prefer school 1, but it would work either way. They could like any other school. What is clear is that everybody ranks the school 3 worse. Okay, and so what this does basically is that, but everybody's going to be truthful here, right? Because if you do deferred acceptance, everybody's going to be truthful. And so you put everybody in their first choice, but then there's overdemand for school 1 because both individual 2 and 3 apply for it. Who gets into that school? Well, it has to be, so yeah, so basically, if individual 2 gets it because his lottery number is higher, okay, then individual, yeah, sorry, so I'm saying this incorrectly. So if individual 3 wins the lottery, okay, then individual 2 will claim, okay, sorry, individual 1 is put into school 2, right? Because nobody else is applying for it. Individual, who's going to get into school 1, it's either going to be individual 2 or individual 1. If it's individual 2, no problem. But if it's individual 1, individual 2 is going to go for his second best option, which is school 2, and is going to kick out the individual from that other school. Okay, so basically what you need to be the case is that these people that live in the neighborhood of the worst school, they're going to be competing for any of the good seats. Okay, they will not care which one it is. Here I just have an example with 1, but if you actually do simulations with more and more people coming from the bad school, because these people just want to get out of their neighborhood, they don't care where, they're going to be systematically competing for the people who just want to trade with each other. Okay, and it's not going to allow for those trades to happen. Yes? Okay, so at the end of the day, what's going to happen with DA is that as the size of how many people live in each of the neighborhood increases, as you see, well, it doesn't have to increase very much, the fraction of people who will be able to get a school that is better than the neighborhood goes down super fast, okay? And all you need is correlation at the bottom. Okay, so it's really the fact that everybody agrees on what they dislike, that basically really this whole point about pedagogical strategies being different and people really choosing among good schools is not happening. Okay, you just basically are assigned to the neighborhood school, and that's it. The channel through which this happens for the Boston mechanism is different. By the way, people are familiar with Boston and yes, I think, yeah. So I don't see more faces, but I guess the ones who are showing their faces, they do not. Oops, okay. So anyways, so with the Boston mechanism, yeah, thank you. With the Boston mechanism, what happens is that having, so you know that people will risk it or not, will risk applying for what they really like or not. So basically in this model, you either risk to apply for the one that you really like, if it's worth it in terms of cardinal payments, okay, depending on the value of V here. So if the value of V is very high, basically nobody will take the risk, and so people will just apply for the neighborhood school directly. And if it's and if the valuation is, if the worst school is not so much worse than the second school, then there may be some choice. But in terms of how vulnerable you are to this existence of commonality at the bottom, the DA is pretty bad as long as its priorities are different for different schools. Okay, and then the third mechanism, which is top trading cycles, of course, does a very good job in being protected from this. No, like the existence of bad schools just means nobody's going to be wanting to trade with these people, but at least among people that do have schools that they can trade is going to allow for this kind of trade. So in that sense, top trading cycles is top. Okay. So very, very quickly, just we have a paper looking like estimating preferences in Barcelona, and we actually find evidence that is consistent with that, which is if your favorite school is out of zone, which is the case in which school choice would really make a difference, we find that DA most often assigns you to the neighborhood school. Okay, and if the favorite is out of zone, the probability that you're assigned to it is maximal with top rating cycles and minimal with DA. Okay, so basically summary and policy relevance is we better get rid of failing school before we even think about choice. Choice is not going to solve any problems unless we actually get rid of those schools that nobody wants. Get rid of or solve the problem that they may that they pose on the systems. Okay.